Hi guys, I am making one video for everyone this week just because many of you had, I guess, kind of like the same types of errors. Now, there was certainly, I think, a solid 1/3 of you got all of the questions correct in terms of highlighting where the commas are and how those commas are associated, or what type of commas they are, what they're doing in that sentence and how they're functioning. If you see, I already went through and graded everyone's. If you see a 6 out of 6 for your week 3 Moodle activity, that means that you did the assignment perfectly, you didn't make any errors, it tells me you understand how to identify those different types of commas. Everyone else, whether you made 1 error or whether you made 5 errors, you got a 5.5 out of 6. So I graded it in somewhat based on accuracy, but also just based on completion. So that is just to, why did you get a 5.5? Because you made the attempt, you tried it out. Some of it was correct, some of it wasn't. So if you see that you got a 5.5, I definitely want you to walk through this video and make sure that you ask me questions if you have them. I'm going to try to clarify some more items because I noticed that some people were making some similar types of mistakes. So I really want to talk about those. I think that I can just go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the interrupter. And in the slides that you see here on your screen, I'm putting every sentence in from the paragraph in here. So in this instance, the fact that you only see 1 sentence means there's only 1 sentence that had an interrupter. And I want to talk a little bit more about that interrupter. So some ways that you could try to identify an interrupter would be, if you took that phrase out, is what came before it and what came after it a complete sentence? If it is, you might have an interrupter. If what came before it is a complete sentence and what came after it is a complete sentence, so then you would have like 2 complete sentences back to back. You probably don't have an interrupter. You probably think that a dependent clause is an interrupter. So I want to kind of do that test here with the interrupter. I've highlighted the 2 commas in blue where you see the information, and I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so that we can all look at it. I know maybe sometimes on your screen it's hard to see what we're working with here. So this is my father, who is one of the few Indians who went to Catholic school on purpose, was an avid reader of westerns, spy thrillers, murder mysteries, gangster epics, basketball player biographies, and anything else he could find. What is interrupting this sentence is the phrase, who is one of the few Indians who went to Catholic school on purpose. Now, that's not a dependent clause because there's not a subject. That can't be its own sentence. Also, if we removed it, then we would see the sentence like, my father was an avid reader of westerns, spy thrillers, etc. That is a complete sentence. So that's one of the ways in which we can say, all right, we had a sentence and something interrupted the flow of that sentence. We had this phrase. That is the only interrupter in this paragraph that we looked at. Now, many of you, I'm going to jump around here for a second because many of you were looking at the dependent-independent clause pairs as interrupters. I saw a lot of people identify this section as an interrupter. So in the sentence that says, my father loved books, and since I loved my father with an aching devotion, I decided to love books as well. A lot of you identified both of these commas to be the commas surrounding an interrupter. So let's take that rule or that test that I was just talking about and identify how this can't be an interrupter because it doesn't meet the requirements of that test. So if I took this out, we would say, my father loved books. and then we would have, I decided to love books as well. So instead of having one flowing complete sentence when we removed that clause, we have two complete sentences, and now they're just joined by commas. That again, that's a way to say, okay, I didn't identify an interrupter, I identified something else. And in this case, it's identifying the dependent clause. So that's one way you can look at an interrupter. Now, going back, I also noticed that many people identified this phrase, my father, as an introductory phrase. But remember, if you take off the introductory phrase, then what follows should still be a complete sentence. So if we had removed my father, then we're going to have something like, who is one of the few Indians who went to Catholic school on purpose, was an avid reader of westerns, spy thrillers, murder mysteries, etc. But we don't have a subject. So when we take away that phrase, my father, we take away the subject of the sentence, and now we have a fragment sentence. We're missing the person doing the action, right? The person who was an avid reader of westerns, etc. So that's one of the tests that you can look at to find the introductory phrase. So I'm going to jump into that really quickly because we have another example here of a type of comma rule where we only have one of those in our entire paragraph. So our introductory phrase here is this: in a fit of unemployment-inspired creative energy. We could remove that, and this is a good test for an introductory phrase. We could remove that, and we could say, okay, does what follows function as a complete sentence? My father built a set of bookshelves and soon filled them with a random assortment of books about the Kennedy assassination, Watergate, the Vietnam War, and the entire 23-book series of the Apache Westerns. Yeah, that could be its own sentence. Okay, so the other thing I want to look at, if we're talking about introductory phrases, is a lot of people identified this as an introductory phrase. When he had extra money, or something like, my father loved books. I understand why, because it's a short grouping of words followed by a comma, and that's a great way to say, I might have an introductory phrase here, but a phrase is not going to have a subject and a verb. So, for example, in our grouping of words that does function as an introductory phrase, we see in a fit of unemployment-inspired creative energy. But we don't have a subject. There's no one in this phrase doing the action. When we keep reading, we understand that my father is the subject, but my father is the subject for this sentence, not for this phrase. It's referring to the father, but that subject is not found in our introductory phrase. So a phrase doesn't have a subject and a verb. That is a clause. So when we're looking at, and this grammar is complicated, y'all. I totally understand. I'm never going to test you on this, but if you want to understand the mechanics behind your grammar, that's the way to do it, is just by kind of recognizing the patterns behind phrases and clauses and things like this. So a clause, phrase, no subject or verb, both of them, right? You could have a subject or you could have a verb, but it's not going to have both. A clause has a subject and a verb. A dependent clause also has a word that's called a subordinated conjunction that makes that clause rely on more information. And an independent clause has a subject and a verb and can be its own sentence. There's nothing that relies on anything. So if we're kind of transitioning into looking at the dependent-independent clause pairs and why they're not introductory phrases, or why the dependent clause is not an introductory phrase, we can think about it this way. So here we have a clause, he had extra money. When he had extra money, we know we have a subject, he, and we know we have a verb, had, right? You've got something there. Now, we can say this is a dependent clause because we're not just saying a statement, he had extra money. We're saying when he had extra money. And because we have the word when there, that's our subordinated conjunction, it's telling us, okay, that relies on more information. Because if I just came up to you and I said, hey, when he had extra money, and I walked away, you'd be like, well, what did he do? What did he do when he had extra money? So in this instance, we have a dependent clause, subject and a verb, and then we have our independent clause. He bought new novels at supermarkets, convenience stores, and hospital gift shops. That could be its own sentence. That's an independent clause. We have another example, and this is probably one of the most trickiest sentences in the whole paragraph that we looked at, because we have 3 clauses here. So let's identify each one, and then we can figure out which comma needed to be highlighted in that sentence if we're looking at a dependent-independent clause pair. So our first clause, my father loved books. We have a subject, father. We have a verb, loved. My father loved books. Can be its own sentence. And since I loved my father with an aching devotion. Okay, now we're looking at our second clause. Let's ignore the and for now. We're going to talk about what that's doing later on. Since I loved my father with an aching devotion. Okay, we have a subject, I. We have a verb, loved. But we also have this word since. Again, if I came up to you and I said, hey, since I loved my father with an aching devotion, you would say, well, since what? Like, what do you mean? Because you loved him. There's more information required. Okay. So that makes this a dependent clause. And then we have this final clause, I decided to love books as well. Starts with the subject, goes to decided, that's our verb, right? You can notice the other thing too. Independent clauses generally begin right with that subject. My father begins with that subject, I. My father loved, subject, verb. I decided, subject, verb. But that's not the case in our dependent clause here, since I loved my father. So we have another word that comes before the subject. And also, if we looked back here, we have another word, when, that came before our subject and our verb. So if you're noticing those patterns, then you can start to say, okay, this is probably a dependent clause. In this sentence, we've got 2 commas. So which is a comma that you needed to highlight? Well, if we're looking for the comma that separates the dependent and independent clause, where the dependent comes first and the independent comes second, then it's that comma between devotion and I. So these are 2 sentences that have the dependent-independent clause pair within them. I'm not really going to talk about lists because nobody had an issue with the list. The question that I will leave with you is just, does Sherman Alexie like the Oxford comma or not? If you have questions about anything we talked about in this video, please let me know. Again, this is the video for everyone. I won't give you individual videos this week for your Moodle activities, just because I think everyone can benefit from this information. So email me if you have questions.